Ruth slid the damp cloth over the golden railing of the grand staircase at the Grand Manhattan, her movements precise and silent, like a well-rehearsed dance. Through the hotel's large windows, the evening light cast elongated shadows on the polished marble, creating a spectacle that only she, always invisible to the guests, seemed to notice. Her fingers, calloused from years of hard work, still carried the memory of other calluses, the ones formed by endless hours of dedication to the piano. Sometimes, when she was alone like this, she allowed herself to remember the touch of the ivory keys, the sensation of the instrument vibrating beneath her hands, the notes she once heard, but that now existed only in her memories. The clock read 4:30 p.m., and Ruth knew she needed to hurry. In 2 hours, Sophia, her 8-year-old daughter, would be leaving her physical therapy session. Her cleaning salary barely covered the girl's medical expenses, but Ruth refused to give up. Sophia was all she had left, her only music in a world that had turned silent. As she ascended to the 10th floor to begin cleaning the next set of suites, Ruth caught a glimpse of her distorted reflection in the elevator mirror. The hotel's gray uniform, 3 sizes too big for her, couldn't completely conceal the natural elegance of her movements, a remnant of her years at the conservatory. 10 years had passed since the accident, but her body still moved with the grace of a musician. In the hallway, she crossed paths with Mrs. Peterson, a regular guest at the hotel who always treated her as if she were part of the decor. Ruth saw her lips move, probably in some complaint about the towels, but she merely nodded politely. Her ability to read lips had improved considerably over the years, but some guests spoke too quickly, unaware of her condition. The phone in her pocket vibrated. It was the alarm she had set to remind her of Sophia's medication. She would need to stop by the pharmacy before picking up her daughter. Last week's salary was already gone, but the manager, Mr. Collins, had promised her an advance. He was one of the few who knew her story, though not all the details. After finishing the floor, she returned to the lobby, where preparations for the evening's charity event were already underway. Staff members were placing floral arrangements strategically, and a Steinway grand piano had just been delivered. Ruth's heart clenched at the sight of the instrument. It was identical to the one she had played in her final performance at the international competition where her original composition, "Ma'am! Hey, ma'am!" The sharp voice of one of the event organizers, and more than anything, his exaggerated arm gestures, snapped her back to reality. She quickly stepped away from the piano, realizing she had gotten too close, drawn in by a force she couldn't control. The lobby was beginning to buzz with the arrival of the first guests for the cocktail reception before the main event. Among them, Ruth immediately recognized the imposing figure of Richard Thompson, the billionaire who had recently acquired a significant stake in the hotel. His presence always caused a stir among the staff, mostly because he had a reputation for getting people fired with a mere raise of an eyebrow. Thompson strode through the lobby as if he owned it entirely, his impeccably tailored Italian suit reflecting in the mirrored surfaces of the room. His cold eyes swept the space, pausing briefly on Ruth, who was discreetly trying to move away from the piano. A sneer formed on his lips when he noticed her interest in the instrument. "Perhaps our cleaning staff needs a reminder of their duties," he remarked loudly enough for other guests to hear, eliciting quiet chuckles from those nearby. Ruth couldn't hear his words, but the disdain in his expression said it all. At that moment, Mr. Collins appeared, his face red with concern, frantically gesturing for Ruth to retreat to the service area. But something had changed in the air. The piano, the muffled laughter, the contempt in Thompson's eyes, all of it awakened something Ruth had buried long ago. Tonight would be different. She could feel it. The Grand Manhattan's main hall was gradually transforming into a scene of opulence. Crystal glasses clinked, designer gowns glided across the marble floor, and the scent of rare orchids perfumed the air. Ruth watched everything from the shadows, as she always did, while finishing the cleaning of the French windows. Richard Thompson had positioned himself at the center of the hall, like a king in his court. His circle of sycophants grew by the minute, their artificial laughter echoing through the room. From time to time, his eyes met Ruth's, and a malicious smile formed on his lips. "Miss, I need you to clean that area again." Mr. Collins nervously gestured toward the piano, where a few empty glasses had been left behind. Ruth nodded, though her heart raced with every step toward the instrument. As she gathered the glasses, her fingers lightly brushed against the side of the piano. The contact, though brief, sent an electric current through her body. For a moment she forgot where she was and allowed her hand to glide over the polished surface, tracing its familiar contours. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Thompson's voice couldn't reach Ruth's ears, but his imposing presence near her was impossible to ignore. "Our cleaning lady seems fascinated by the Steinway. Perhaps we should provide a bit of entertainment for our guests." The hall gradually fell silent, and Ruth realized that all eyes were now on her. Thompson had stepped even closer, his expensive cologne invading her personal space in a suffocating way. "Do you like the piano?" He exaggerated the movement of his lips as he spoke, as if addressing a child. Ruth read them perfectly but remained still. "Why don't you play something for us? I'm sure everyone would love to see a unique performance." Mr. Collins appeared beside Ruth, his face a mask of panic. "Mr. Thompson, please. She's just doing her job." No, I insist." Thompson raised a hand, silencing the manager. "Our employee seems to have a special interest in musical instruments. It would be a shame to deprive her of this opportunity." The guests had formed a semicircle around the piano, some laughing quietly, others watching with barely concealed discomfort. Ruth remained motionless, her hands still resting lightly on the piano as an internal battle raged within her. 10 years had passed since her fingers had touched a real piano. 10 years of self-imposed silence, of hiding in the shadows, of denying who she truly was. The ivory keys gleamed under the hall's lights, calling to her like a long-lost lover. Thompson mistook her hesitation for fear. "Come on, don't be shy. Show us your talent." His cruel smile widened as he pulled out the piano bench, gesturing theatrically for her to sit. Ruth looked at Mr. Collins, who seemed about to faint, then at the expectant faces of the guests. Finally, her eyes settled on the piano. In her mind, she clearly heard the first notes of her award-winning composition, the one that had never been played for an audience. Slowly, to everyone's surprise, she moved toward the bench. The silence that followed was dense, almost palpable. Ruth adjusted the bench with the familiarity of someone who knew every detail of this ritual. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly, as long-buried memories erupted in her mind. "This is ridiculous," Thompson sneered. "Someone should stop this." But before he could finish his sentence, the first notes filled the air. Mr. Collins, who had taken 2 steps toward Ruth to stop her, froze in place. The sound that emerged from the piano was unlike anything the audience had ever heard, a melody that seemed to tell a story of loss, redemption, and hope. Even without hearing, Ruth felt every vibration through her fingers, through the floor beneath her feet, through every fiber of her being. The piece she played was her own story turned into music, the sound of silence that had become her life. Thompson, realizing that his plan to humiliate Ruth was turning into something entirely different, attempted to step forward to interrupt the performance. However, 2 of his own guests discreetly held him back by the arms. "Let her finish," someone whispered, and for the first time that night, Richard Thompson was forced into silence. As her fingers danced over the piano, Ruth was transported back to that fateful night, 10 years ago. She had been on the verge of making her international debut, presenting an original composition at the prestigious international music competition in Vienna. The theater had been packed. Her family sat in the front row, her mother, her father, her younger sister. All of them there to witness the moment she had worked her entire life for. The road to that night had not been easy. Sleepless nights filled with relentless practice, countless sacrifices, unwavering determination. But fate had other plans. On the way back to the hotel after the thunderous applause and the announcement of her victory, a drunk driver ran a red light. The impact was devastating. Ruth survived, But the severe acoustic trauma from the crash gradually stole her hearing. Within weeks, the world of sound disappeared completely, and with it, her dreams, her confidence, her identity as a musician. Now, seated at the piano in the Grand Manhattan, every note she played was a reconnection with that lost past. Her hands moved on their own, remembering every nuance of the composition that had marked both her triumph and her tragedy. The music reached its climax, and Ruth, completely immersed in her memories, let a single tear slip down her cheek. She couldn't hear the audience's murmurs of admiration, nor did she notice that several guests were also in tears, moved by the raw emotion of her performance. The silence that followed the last note was absolute, as if the very air had frozen in the Grand Manhattan's Grand Hall. Ruth kept her eyes closed, her hands still trembling slightly above the piano keys. Through her palms, she could feel the last vibrations of the instrument fading away, like a distant echo of her old life. Then, a movement in the audience made her open her eyes. An elderly man, with graying hair and a distinguished posture, was making his way through the crowd. His face bore a mixture of astonishment and recognition that made Ruth's chest tighten. She knew him, Viktor Petrov, the renowned maestro who had been present on that fateful night in Vienna. Impossible. His lips moved, and Ruth could clearly read the word. This composition, I would recognize it anywhere. The maestro approached the piano with slow, almost reverent steps, as if afraid that a sudden movement might shatter the enchantment of the moment. His eyes, brimming with restrained tears, studied every detail of Ruth's face, searching for the young prodigy who had disappeared a decade ago. The guests, still spellbound by the performance, watched the scene in complete silence. Even Richard Thompson, who had worn a smug smile moments ago, now bore a stunned expression, as if he had been struck by an invisible blow. Viktor Petrov turned to the audience, his presence commanding immediate attention. When he began to speak, his voice carried the weight of the history he was about to reveal. Exactly 10 years ago, he began, I was seated at a judge's table at the international competition in Vienna. Among hundreds of extraordinary compositions, one stood out, a piece that told a story so deep, so visceral, that it left us speechless. It was this very composition we just heard. Ruth watched the maestro's lips move, while Mr. Collins, who had learned basic sign language over the years working with her, discreetly interpreted his words. Each sentence made her heartbeat quicken, bringing back memories she had fought so hard to bury. The young composer, Petrov continued, his voice thick with emotion, was a prodigy of only 22 years old. Her name was Ruth Winters. That night, after receiving first prize, she suffered a terrible accident. We searched for her for months, but it was as if she had vanished from the face of the earth. A murmur of astonishment spread through the hall. Some guests who had laughed earlier now covered their mouths with their hands, ashamed. Richard Thompson had stepped back a few paces, his previous arrogance completely dissipated. But the true miracle, Petrov's voice grew stronger, is not just that we found her today. It is that, even after losing her hearing in that accident, Ruth Winters never lost her musical soul. What we witnessed tonight was not just a performance. It was a testament to the indomitable power of the human spirit. The maestro turned back to Ruth, who remained seated at the piano, silent tears streaming down her face. He extended his hand to her, a gesture that transcended the need for words or sound. The audience, which had gathered for what they thought was an ordinary charity event, now found themselves witnessing something far more significant, the moment when a lost artist returned to the light, emerging from the shadows where she had hidden for so long. The hall erupted in applause. The sound, which Ruth could not hear, was reflected in the emotional expressions around her. Richard Thompson, who had retreated toward the ballroom doors, suddenly found himself at the center of attention when Viktor Petrov raised a hand, quieting the audience. "Mr. Thompson," the maestro pronounced clearly, allowing Ruth to read his lips. "I believe this moment offers us a unique opportunity. You, who take such pride in your philanthropic contributions, could turn this incident into something truly meaningful. The billionaire adjusted his tie, visibly uncomfortable. His eyes darted around the hall, meeting only faces filled with expectation and judgment. Naturally, he managed to articulate, "I'd be happy to make a donation." "Not just a donation," Petrov continued, his voice taking on the authoritative tone Ruth recognized from her competition days. "I propose the creation of a full music program for deaf children, a center where talents like Ruth can teach, inspire, and prove that music transcends the ability to hear." Thompson, cornered by social pressure and his own humiliation, tried to maintain a last vestige of control. "And how much do you suggest for such a program?" $5 million would be a reasonable start," Petrov responded without hesitation. "Enough to establish the first center and sustain it for 2 years." The silence that followed was tense. Thompson looked around, aware that every person in the hall was waiting for his response. Finally, with a forced smile, he pulled out his checkbook. A year later, Ruth stood on the stage of the New York Philharmonic, not as a janitor dreaming of her past, but as an artist reclaiming her future. Dressed in an elegant black gown, she bowed before a standing ovation after the premiere of her new composition, Symphony of Silence. In the front row, Sophia beamed with pride, fully recovered thanks to the medical care Ruth's new position as a resident composer had provided. Beside her, Mr. Collins applauded with tears in his eyes, proud of the transformation he had witnessed. The Ruth Winters Music Center for Deaf Children had become a reality, occupying a renovated building just a few blocks from the Grand Manhattan. Every morning before her rehearsals with the orchestra, Ruth dedicated 2 hours to teaching young musicians who, like her, refused to let the absence of sound limit their artistic expression. Richard Thompson never returned to the hotel, but his checks arrived on time, now accompanied by letters expressing genuine support for the program. His public humiliation had turned into a lesson in humility, revealing a surprisingly human side to the billionaire. That night, after the concert, Ruth sat at the piano once more. The hall was empty, but she didn't need an audience. Her fingers glided across the keys, creating a melody only she could fully feel. It was a different music now, not one born from pain and loss, but a celebration of life, resilience, and the discovery that sometimes losing something precious leads us to something even more valuable. In the silence of her world, Ruth had finally found her truest voice. And through it, she was helping others find their own.